Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the What the Research Says, playing games to build relationships and learn empathy, how tabletop role-playing games help players grow webinar with Dr. Megan Connell, psychologist, author, consultant, and co-founder of HealthQuest Innovative Therapeutics. This webinar is being co-sponsored by the American Library Association's Gaming Roundtable. My name is George Bergstrom, and I'm the Southern Regional Coordinator with the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office, and I'll be the question moderator for today. I'd like to start off the webinar with a few quick announcements. To register for other webinars or other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library. The session is 1 hour, so you'll get 1 LEU for today. If you are watching the archived recording of this webinar, the instructions on how to obtain your LEU are available in the video's description on YouTube. Or you can also find those instructions on the Indiana State Library's continuing education site under the LEU policies. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Megan.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. So, hello, I am Dr. Megan Connell. I'm a psychologist, applied game master. I'm the author of Tabletop Role-Playing Therapy, the guide for the clinician game master from Norton Publishing. And I love talking about all the amazing things that we can learn and do through gaming. And since I know of a lot of folks who play tabletop role-playing games and other games through the library systems, I'm really excited to be talking with you all and sharing a bit more about what these games are, how they operate, and what they can do for the people coming in and playing them. I do have the chat open, so I'll try to be tracking questions as well as George, but feel free to ask throughout. I don't mind pausing the talk to address questions. Also, I'm going to try to be very conscientious to not engage with terminology, but in case I'm using terms that you don't know, please just put the letter T in the chat with the term you didn't know, so that way I know to define my terms for you. All right. So what we are going to be talking about today is understanding and defining why gaming is important for humans to participate in. Why do we game, essentially? We're going to discuss how research on engagement with narratives can help us to build empathy, and then how we can utilize safety tools in our games to make sure that we're creating a safe space for gaming to happen to allow for emotional and social growth and development. So quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to be defining our terms, so talking about what is a game, defining the concept of the magic circle, talking through different types of games, and then defining and discussing what specifically tabletop role-playing games are. We're going to kind of pause in there and go back and talk a little bit about why is gaming important? What is it about gaming that really is so powerful for us? Looking a little bit into the research and kind of understanding how gaming helps us build empathy and to develop our sense of self and to grow emotionally. And then how to run games that have growth in mind and utilizing safety tools to help us be able to run these games in a way that allows for our players to communicate discomfort and to discuss the issues that they need to. I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end to answer more questions and to have a discussion. So first off, what exactly is a game? This seems like an odd question to ask to start off with, but I think it is an important thing to know. So Jewell 2003 defined games as an activity where players have an objective that they find desirable and wish to achieve. So earlier, someone was asking if Duolingo can count as a game. And yes, if it has an objective that you find desirable, which could be the streak of hitting the certain numbers, it is a game and you find that desirable. Yes. Something that we think about a lot, though, is gaming and play is it fun, right? And this is an interesting thing because a lot of times you might see people playing tabletop role-playing games and see that it doesn't look like it's traditionally fun. You could see a lot of emotional content coming up, people being distressed, crying, and it is still a game, though. Games don't have to be fun. Although oftentimes they are, and that's part of what is intrinsically motivating about them and why we connect with games. But a lot of times they might not be fun. And so I think that's something for us to keep in mind when we're talking about a game. It's not always going to be a fun experience. It's going to be usually something that we are glad to have done, but not always something that is fun. I guess maybe we could equate it to like going to the gym. It's not always fun, but a lot of times we're very happy that we have gone. And games are indeed a form of play. And play does not need to be something that is fun, and it happens throughout the lifespan. I think, especially in America, we too often frame the idea of play as something that ends with childhood. And this really isn't true. We play throughout our entire lives. One thing that Dietering in 2018 wrote about was that adults often need to have this idea of an alibi in order to allow us to play. And so this could be a thing of like, well, I don't really like playing softball. I mean, I wouldn't play softball on my own, but my company has a softball team that's raising money for charity. And so like it would be wrong of me not to participate, right? Because I want to support the charity. So I'm going to play to do that. And so that's how we get these alibis. It's sort of like this buy-in of like, um, I don't enjoy playing Pokemon, but my kids do. So I kind of have to play with my kids because that's my alibi. And it's a little bit ridiculous. Like we can, as adults, play and just enjoy playing and play for the sake of play. One of the things that's really powerful with gaming is this concept called the magic circle. And I think this is something really important to understand because when we're observing play at the gaming tables, it's this interesting thing where rules have changed. And so this term is called the magic circle. It's where the rules of play of the game start to apply. It's essentially this place where the difference between our day-to-day lives and the rules and expectations of the game take over. And so this gives us permission to behave differently than we would in the real world. To take a concept from, or just to give an example from sports, right? If I was walking down the street and I saw somebody and I put on a padded glove and I punched them in the face, I would be charged with assault. That is a crime. But I do this exact same behavior in the magic circle of the boxing ring, and it's fine. That's a desirable, encouraged behavior in that magic circle. And so, while, talking in the silly voices of the characters that you're portraying is kind of weird to do day to day, when we're around the gaming table and rolling dice and telling a story, it's totally acceptable. And so there's a lot of things that we can see happen within the magic circle that we might not see outside. Something that you might notice is folks who are traditionally very shy and reserved, when they're sitting down to play a role-playing game, if they're playing a character who is boisterous and outgoing, suddenly they embody that and they become that. And a lot of that is because there is that magic circle. It's the rules have changed. The expectations are different. And so when we're creating gaming spaces, this is something that we want to keep in mind of like, how do we help make a space where the magic circle can exist, right? So like if we have a game that's happening in kind of this aside area where not too many other people are coming in, people are going to feel much more engaged with the rules of the game and being in the magic circle versus if the game's happening like in the middle of a corridor where people are walking around all the time and are kind of looking in and being like, what's going on here? It's going to be much harder to engage with that rule set of the magic circle. So when we're talking about games, there's a wide range of games that we can talk about and look at. So, board games, it's a wide array of styles of games that will utilize some sort of board to track the progress and play. So these can include worker placement games, strategy games, deck building games, cooperative games, and so on. And I'm bringing these up because these different types of games often are involved in role-playing games, but they are not necessarily a role-playing game, but they can also have a lot of utility and value. Card games are going to be games that utilize a deck of cards. This can range from anything like poker or other games that utilize just a standard 52 card deck to special deck building games like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, or to games that use like a very specific deck to play them, such as Cards Against Humanity. I think most people are familiar with that game. Party games are games typically for larger groups, typically 6 or more, and the focus of these games is to create a fun experience for the whole group. So these games are going to be very focused on the fun aspect of play and not so much the narrative serious side of play. And then we have tabletop role-playing games, which we're going to primarily be focusing on here, which is a narrative game where one player will typically act as a storyteller, game master, narrator, and the other players act as player characters that exist within the world of that game. So when we're looking at tabletop role-playing games, very broadly speaking, again, it's that game where one player is the narrator of the world and everybody else controls a character that exists within the world. When we are really dissecting role-playing games and looking at what is it about them that makes them a very unique and different experience from other styles of gaming, there's a few specifics that kind of come to light. One of the big ones is immersion. These games are incredibly immersive, where you just feel completely drawn into the narrative of the story. This is sort of almost a baffling idea for a lot of our folks who work in video gaming, because to make a game immersive for video gaming, a lot of that involves graphics and technology, right? The more you can up the realism of the experience of the game, the more drawn in and immersive it can feel. Role-playing games can feel incredibly immersive without anything, right? The minimum equipment that you need to run a tabletop role-playing game is usually some dice, a pencil, and a piece of paper. And just with those things, people can really get involved and dive in and feel connected with this. And so it has this ability to draw people in. We'll revisit this in a little bit, but something that's very interesting is if you know people who play tabletop role-playing games, ask them a question about something really cool their character did. It's just gonna be like, tell me the coolest thing you've ever done in a game. And what you'll find is the person talks in first person about it. It's not a thing of like, oh, well, there's this one time when my character went across the bridge and had to fight a troll, and the troll did this stuff, and then I had my character do these things, right? They're going to talk about it instead of, oh, there was this one time we had to fight a bridge troll, and I went sprinting across the bridge, and then somebody else started, pouncing in and doing this stuff. And it's almost like these gaming memories are encoded as personal narrative memories. It's an interesting thing. It's not that the person has a discrepancy of reality. Like they understand that I wasn't actually at this bridge. I was narrating a character at the bridge. But it feels real in that. Um, we're seeing that a question for what is the game on this top shelf, the second on the top shelf. So that's actually a supplement for fifth edition role-playing games called Twisted Taverns. I forget the company that made it, but it's a really great supplement. It's got, I think, 6 or 7 taverns in there with quests that you can find in the tavern, patrons of the tavern, a map of the tavern, and my favorite thing is each tavern has its own menu, which is super fun. I'm a big fan of getting supplements because I don't want to rely always on my imagination. Another big aspect of tabletop role-playing games is it allows for agency, that the players have total control over what their characters do. We play in an agreed upon world, and as long as what we're proposing works within the confines of that shared world, it can happen, right? So like if we're playing in a medieval fantasy setting, I'm not going to say I pull out a backpack rocket and I rocket up into the sky, because that doesn't fit with the technology of the setting we're in. But maybe I say I cast a spell that lets me fly, and I can fly up and kind of do the same thing. The only limitation is your own imagination, really, when we're talking about agency in a tabletop game. And the other really amazing thing is you get to have meaningful interaction with the world. Um, if you've ever played role-playing games that are video games, everything's coded into the game, and a lot of times video games kind of just reset if you leave an area and then you come back. And so if you had your character do something pretty terrible, as soon as you go to a different part of the map and then come back, it's like everybody forgot about the terrible thing you did and they just go on about their lives. And so it doesn't really feel like you're meaningfully interacting with the world. And so with tabletop role-playing games, it's a really amazing thing to, go to a town, and if your characters are terrible, You leave and then you come back and suddenly the town is not opening its gates to you because you were terrible. That there are consequences, both good and bad, for your actions. And for a lot of my players that have been playing video games and come to tabletop games for the first time, that's such a powerful thing for them of like, oh my gosh, the choices that we make actually matter. What we're doing in this game actually matters. It's not predestined that we will succeed. We really have to be thinking about what we're doing and how we're doing this, which I think is really powerful. Not to be self-serving, but the definition that I utilized in my book for tabletop gaming, role-playing games, is that it's a game in which a player is controlling a character that lives in an agreed-upon gaming world, and that player has narrative control over the actions of their character. I think this is just important to keep in mind of these different aspects, that you're controlling a character, they're in an agreed-upon world, and you have the narrative authority over that character and what happens to that character. When we are talking about playing tabletop role-playing games, we're looking at three primary pillars of play. So these are three narrative areas that are going to be in most tabletop games. The first is role-playing. So this is where the players can talk to one another in character, or they're talking with non-player characters or NPCs in a setting. And so this is a great time to, in my groups, we focus on learning how to advocate for ourselves and set boundaries through play, right? And so maybe I have a very pushy NPC who's like, all right, well, you sure that you can't go and do this thing because I really think you should go and do this thing. And then the players can role play. I'm like, no, we don't have time. We're not doing that. We're on another quest. You're going to have to take care of that yourself. And, we could kind of continue to work on practicing that firm no and going through these things. Another piece of the role-playing games is exploration. And so this is finding new locations, going into our uncharted lands, exploring ruins. It's also, in a lot of ways, exploring culture, right? It's a lot of folks that I work with are on the autism spectrum, and so picking up nonverbal cues and understanding kind of the cues of the world around them can be very challenging. And so narrating what is seen and what customs they're observing and what that might mean for how to interact with the world can be very important in here. And then the final piece is combat or conflict. And so this is fighting monsters, engaging in challenges from the environment. So this doesn't necessarily have to be that we are fighting a monster. It could be your ship comes to the end of its course and now you have to climb the cliffs of despair. What do you do? How do you go forward? And so it's overcoming these things. The way the players engage with these different challenges in role-playing games is through chance. So they're going to roll dice. Depending on the gaming system, depends on what they roll, but typically they'll roll something like a 6-sided die, which is the cube dice that we're all kind of used to seeing in traditional board games, or they go up to like a 20-sided dice. And typically, from a lot of gaming systems, a higher roll indicates success, while a lower roll indicates some sort of failure. And how successful or unsuccessful you are depends on what you roll and how difficult the task was. Sometimes, game masters will have somebody roll just to say, like, okay, let's see how neat it is, how cool it is that you do this thing. Like, it could just be opening a door, right? And it's like, oh, okay, let's just roll a check. And it's like, if you open it really well, it's like, okay, you can open it with a flourish, or you just kind of swing it open. I don't know. It's the dice can add this little bit of chance, that understanding that even some people who are very well trained and highly skilled can have bad days. And so that brings in a lot of cool elements into the game. So let's kind of back up for a moment and talk about, why does gaming matter? It's like one of those things of like, we know we play across the lifespan, we know play is important, but specifically, why is gaming so important to us as humans? There is no culture on earth that doesn't have a game. Every culture has a form of gaming. These can be different types of sports or tabletop or board games that exist worldwide. Sociologist John Hinza even noted that he thought we should be called Homo laden, man the player, because games are such a vital part of our collective culture. And so this really indicates that we have a need to play. And again, the games that we see worldwide, some of the oldest games that are known to humanity are not children's games. They're games that adults played throughout their lifespan. And so they're not just for children. We need the games and we need to engage with games. And so I think something that is really important is being intentional with our use of games to help build skills across the lifespan. Before we started recording and streaming, I mentioned that my personal collection has ballooned to about 200 board games now. That's not including the different role-playing systems I have, by the way, which is a lot. um, but it's important. I have children, and when I notice them struggling with different concepts or different things, oftentimes what I do is I grab a game that I think will help with that skill set. And so being intentional with how we play can really help augment the things that we're trying to learn. So if we think about the different functions of games, like games can just basically teach information, right? If we think about like basic children's counting, color games, things like that. Also, trivia games can teach us a lot about different aspects of the world. We can learn amazing problem solving skills through gaming. Um, and then we can do, puzzle type games to solve different puzzles. There's a cool game called the Turing Machine that is about early computing using punch holes and having to solve problems to figure out which things to do there, which is super fun. Strategy games, chess, war games, Risk, Stratego if you want to not, or what, no, is it Axes and Allies if you want to ruin all your friendships, right? Cooperative play are some of my favorite games. So this is where we use different skills to achieve a shared goal. If you all haven't played any of the Forbidden series, Forbidden Island, Forbidden Desert, Forbidden Skies, and now Forbidden Jungle just came out this year, I highly encourage you to play those games. Each person in the game takes on a different role and has a different ability, and you have a shared goal that you're all trying to work towards. The designer of the games, I'm forgetting his name, but he does such a good job of balancing the mechanics that
Matt
it's
Leacock.
either, who is
Matt
it?
Leacock. Matt Leacock.
Matt Leacock, yeah, they're great. It's you either and every win I've had has been a very near loss, and it's really, really an amazing thing. But these cooperative games are awesome because we're all working together. We're having to communicate and plan. There's an awesome game of Wonder Woman from Ravensburger, where you have a planning phase and everybody has to make a plan, but you only get to see half of your resources. And then when you go into the execution phase, you see the rest of your resources so you can determine if you're able to follow through with your plan and then moving and acting. And so it's a really cool way to engage with everybody and to work together. And tabletop role-playing games are also incredibly cooperative. And again, culture. Again, games are part of every culture and they communicate about the origin of our cultures. If you all are not familiar with the Reacting to the Past series of games, please, please, please look them up. They are a series of history games where you role play as different historical figures during different pieces of history. And so you're learning history through engaging with role play of it. It is absolutely fascinating and super fun. But it's a great way also to teach culture and to kind of teach that idea of what was important at that time, what was valued, and how do we bring what was valued forward. And then again, what we're really going to be talking about here now is building empathy. And that's where, role-playing games, I think, have everything that we just talked about in there, right? We can teach information, we can learn problem solving, strategy, cooperative play, culture through role-playing games. With learning culture through role-playing games, there's actually an amazing setting called Sina Una that is Filipino myths and legends that have been brought into a fifth edition setting. So fifth edition of Dungeons and Dragons. All of the people working on the project are Filipino. All of the artists are Filipino. So it is very much so from the culture to showcase their culture to the world. There's another one that's coming up from, I can't remember who's producing it. It was on Kickstarter. I backed it. It hasn't delivered yet though, but it's Mayan and Aztec and South American culture that's brought into tabletop role-playing games. So it's really cool what we can do with that. But let's talk about how do we build empathy? How can empathy grow? So I realized I hadn't defined empathy. So again, empathy is our ability to not only understand how someone else is feeling, but kind of understand their viewpoint of it. Pardon me. And so really learning to see the world and experience the world through the eyes of another. And so some really interesting studies have been done on how can we build this skill. I think for a long time, it was thought of to be something you kind of either had or you didn't, not that it was a skill, which really isn't true. Most everything is a skill that can be learned. And so some of the research that I found is showing how much of an impact reading has on empathy. And so if you all aren't familiar with these studies, definitely keep them in your back pocket, that the more we read, the more empathy we can develop. And those gains are even bigger when we identify with the main character that we're reading about. If we're reading about a main character we don't really care about, eh, we kind of take it or leave it, right? It's not necessarily going to be a huge gain in empathy. But if it's somebody where we're like, oh my gosh, this is so like me, this is so like my life, we gain that empathy even more. And so while this has not been studied, unfortunately, I think it is a very reasonable guess or hypothesis that a character that you create existing in a world where you control that character is going to have empathy gains at least equal to identifying with a character in a story. And so that's, I think, something that's really important, that we can have that character that we create. And that's maybe something I should address here for those who don't play tabletop role-playing games. Where do the characters come from? There's two main ways that you can get a character in role-playing games. One is what we call a pre-gen, which is the game master has a paper with the character on it, they hand it to you, and you play that character. But most folks will create their own characters. They come up with an idea of a character that they want to play. They create their stats. They talk about their backstory. They create the people that were important to this character, their mentors, their family, uh, their nemesis, and all of that, and really dive into creating that character and creating that narrative. And so, like, we can't make characters without having a little bit of us in them. One of my favorite talks to do at gaming conventions is talking about what we can learn from the characters we create. I like the way I open that talk is I ask everybody in the audience to imagine all the different characters that they've played throughout the years, and then to imagine them all in a party together. Um, and this is usually where everyone goes, oh God, right? It's like, yes, welcome to your issues that have just popped up, right? Our stuff can't help but show up in our characters. And so they can offer this a really amazing way for us to learn and grow in an incredibly safe environment where there aren't real world consequences. And so how does this growth happen in role-playing games? So there's a concept from LARPing called bleed. So LARP is live action role plays. And it was Bowman didn't create the term, but she's the one who has written the most about it. Sarah Lynn Bowman, she has some excellent books. They're all cited in the references for this. But she talks about bleed. And so bleed in is stuff from the player to the character, right? So this could be I'm having a bad day. I'm super grumpy. There's no reason for my character in the game to be grumpy or aggressive, but because I feel grumpy and aggressive, my character is going to behave in a way that's grumpy and aggressive. And so that's where my stuff is leaching into the character, or can come out going from the character to the player. So this could be something along the lines of an NPC that my character was incredibly close to just died. And I was trying to save them and I failed. And I feel devastated, right? Now, for me, the human, nothing happened, but that narrative connection is what kind of brings that emotion into play. I use the term emotional permeability for this, not because I just like adding syllables to things, but because I am a clinician and I write clinical notes. And if I write, so-and-so experienced a lot of bleed out tonight that really, I think, led to a transformative moment where they were able to reflect more upon their own actions. somebody who does not understand that term is going to read that note and go, what? And so emotional permeability, even though while it's not defined, it does allow for folks to kind of understand, okay, we're seeing something with emotion here. And I can explain that term a bit in the note. It just, again, clinically, it sounds better than saying bleed in and bleed out, because clinically the term bleed has a very different meaning. And so I do a little bit better with visuals because I always forget which way they go. So bleed in is from the player to the character, bleed out is from the character to the player. And that's my amazing bard, Torina. She is retired because she got to level 20. I did get to a level 20 in a campaign for D&D. That's the highest level you can get to. It's very rare for a game to go there. It took us 6 years, I think. So yeah. And that artist is Allison Howell. She does amazing art. I don't get anything from her plugging it. I just love her. I love her art style. The other thing that is incredibly powerful with role-playing games are narrative frames. And so this is the findings from Gary Allen Fine's Shared Fantasy Study that was published in 1983. It has not been replicated, which is a crime. It really needs to be replicated because it would be incredibly easy to replicate in this day and age. What Fine did was he went to places where kids were playing Dungeons and Dragons, which included police stations. Like police stations would host game nights for local teenagers to come in and play, which I thought was really cool. But he observed over 200 hours of kids and adults playing D&D, and he coded it all, didn't record it, just live watched it and live coded it. And so like we could do this with all of the live play, actual play shows that are out there to replicate it. It would not be very hard. Yeah, the Satanic Panic happened just after. Like Fine Study was published, and then that's when Mazes and Monsters came out later that year, and that's when all the stuff started happening. The Satanic Panic, I think, is directly the cause of us not having good research on tabletop role-playing games. Some really fascinating early preliminary studies were starting to come out about what could be done and what could be learned and the skills and how it could be an amazing tool in the early 1980s. But after about 1986, there is nothing, which is incredibly unfortunate. And so what Fine noticed, though, in play was that there are 3 frames that you have to hold simultaneously to be able to engage with a tabletop role-playing game. The first is the frame of the player. And so this is understanding the person behind the character, the I. I am this. I want these things. The second is the frame of the rules of the game, understanding what all those numbers and squiggles on that character sheet mean. And so it's knowing the rules of the game and the rules of the narrative, understanding the gaming setting. So again, understanding if you're in a fantasy setting, you're not using a jetpack, you're using a magic spell. And then the frame of the character, understanding how your character views the world, their wants, their motivations, and their desires. So again, because I do better with visuals, here's a visual of that. If there is confusion between any of these 3 frames, the play just cannot happen. Play starts to fall apart. It can fall apart in very funny ways. If anybody isn't familiar with the tabletop story of the Dread Gazebo, do yourself a favor and look it up. The kind of quick of it is one of the players at the table didn't know what a gazebo was. And so they thought it was a monster. And hilarity ensued. But there was a disconnect between the frame of the player and the frame of the character. The character was experiencing something in the world that the player did not have an understanding of. And because of that disconnect, play kind of fell apart. And so when we're also having that frame confusion between the player and the character, that can be really hard, especially if a character does something to another character and the player takes it as a personal attack, which can also be sometimes a player has their character do something to another character as a personal attack, right? That's I wouldn't say that's frame confusion, that's more frame manipulation. but it's sort of understanding those things. And we have to be able to traverse the 3 frames. And it's a very simple thing to do. It's one of those things you hear it, it doesn't sound all that complicated. But when you think about what's going on in the brain and all the stuff we're having to keep organized in order to do this, it's really impressive. And so, for example, I might say, right, Torina's going to go forward and try to do a performance to win over this crowd. Roll my dice with my modifier. I got a 19. Can someone please pass the chips? All right. So what I said with Torina's going to go and do this thing. That's the frame of the character, the actions of the character. I rolled a 19. That's the frame of the rules. And then can someone pass the chips? That's me. I want chips. My character doesn't know chips exist, unfortunately for her. And so we go between these things. And so how this is applicable to you all, especially if you're hosting gaming nights at your libraries and things like that, is if there's frustration starting to happen at the table, sometimes the culprit is frame confusion. And so being able to talk about the character is different than the player. And when people can keep that distinction in their minds very well, conflict at the table, it can actually be incredibly powerful. I had a game once where we had a rogue who was very impulsive, and we had a cleric who was a rules follower and was gonna the rogue, I don't even remember what the rogue had done, but is something that got them in trouble. And all the players at the table were laughing. They thought it was hilarious, including the player who controlled the cleric. But she like looked at this other player and it was like, my character is super mad at your character right now. Like, I think my character kind of wants to punch your character. And this other player's like, I mean, yeah, if you feel like that needs to happen, go ahead and do it. I think that might actually help my character grow and develop a little bit here. And so this was a great instance of frame clarity, right? Where the players were having a good time and laughing, but they understood their characters were in a very different headspace from them and utilizing the rules of the game to kind of navigate all of that. All right. So there are many, many gaming systems out there. In my book, I talk about Dungeons and Dragons a lot because it's the gaming system I play the most frequently. But there are other stories out there. And there are stories that are specifically designed to help build empathy. The one I pictured here, One Child's Heart. If you will humor me for a moment, I'm just going to read you the first couple sentences of the introduction. One Child's Heart explores the participant's ability to create human connection through role play, show kindness to a stranger, and support those around them during difficult times. Players take on the role of a mental health care professional, community leaders, and social service workers who have the chance to travel into the memories of a young person to help them reframe troubling times and learn how to move forward with their lives. Right? And so again, games aren't always fun, but this is a very powerful game that can happen. And there's a lot of role-playing games out there that do focus on difficult topics. Kids on Bikes, I saw someone talk about Stranger Things. If you like Stranger Things, Kids on Bikes is all about that 80s idea of, riding around on a bike, solving mysteries like the Scooby Gang. But there's a lot of difficult stuff in that, right? This idea of kids unsupervised finding dead bodies and, going into combat. Ink is another one that I think is really cool. This one is your characters have died and are in purgatory. And how do you get out of purgatory? And so it's, again, a really interesting concept. 10 Candles is another one that I really like. This one, every character dies at the end of the story. It happens over one gaming session, about 2 hours. And the players have narrative control over how their character dies and what happens. And it can be a very powerful game. And so there's all these different gaming systems out there to help. The Emberwind system from Nom Neoverse is actually designed with existential psychology in mind. And the character creation is sort of meant to mimic almost a personality test. And then another game that is just incredibly powerful. This is actually a bunch of games within one, hashtag feminism, to talk about that cultural learning. This is a way to explore feminism and learning about just different aspects of our culture and how we view women. Emberwind was this other one. And so there's a lot of different narratives out there. If we are using a gaming system like this, so if somebody's wanting to run a game, they're coming in like, I want to run another one that I like, Dread. This uses a Jenga tower to create anxiety during play, and it is a horror game. Is to ask, what are the themes, what's going on, and how do people consent in to these different topics? And so it's really important just to kind of understand that not all these games are lighthearted and just an adventure. Some of them are very deep. And so we want to make sure that players know what they're getting into and that they opt in. And then also that we utilize safety tools to help with communication. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're good. So safety tools are essentially a communication device that players can use in tabletop role-playing games to communicate different levels of discomfort. There are different safety tools. The very first one is lines and veils. So this was developed in the mid-'80s. And it's a way where we have these lines of like, this stuff does not happen in the game. We're just, it's not there. Veils is something that can happen, but it happens off screen. We fade to black, right? Like it might be a thing of if we have somebody who doesn't like spiders, it's like, look, of course spiders can exist in the world. I just don't want them to be in the game that we're part of, right? So that's a veil. It's like, yep, there's spiders, but we're not going to focus on them. A line might be, hey, yeah, I need a world with no cockroaches in it because they're awful. And so those are different ways that we can put things together. Later, the X card was introduced, and this was a card, just a card with an X on it, put in the center of the table, and people would tap it if the topic content was getting too much, and what the game master would do is just immediately push the narrative somewhere else. In response to the X card, the Luxton technique was developed. This was a bit of an expansion on the X card, where if you touch the X card, you could, instead of noping out of a scene, you could say, hey, I need this specific thing from this scene. So it might be a thing of, I really need us to save this kid, or I really need to make sure that we're able to protect this village in some way, right? And so it kind of helps to create a little bit more agency and ability to speak these things. Something that I developed myself was dynamic safety tools, which is these little poker chips you see here. This is my arts and crafts. I bought plain white clay poker chips, and I painted them and I Mod Podged these different symbols on them. So if I do a vibe check, the green is for good to go. I feel fine. Yellow is, I don't love where we are. I'm okay right now, but if we go much more into this, I'm not going to be okay. The red X is for, nope, we've crossed a line, we need to stop. And the blue pause is more for just taking that moment to pause to either ask for rules clarification, lore clarification, a bio break, something else that we need. A great free resource that I highly encourage you all to look into is Monty Cook's Consent in Gaming. Reynolds and Gaiman wrote that or Germain, sorry, wrote that in 2019. It is free. There's a little confusion sometimes for folks when they go onto the Monty Cook website, because you do have to add it to your cart and click buy. But clicking buy, all it does is it gives you the link to the free PDF download. So it's a great resource. In the back, it has a consent form that you can use to check off common triggers, things that you might not want to have in the game. I saw a bunch of stuff. I think it's mostly discussion on amazing gaming systems. So
Yeah, the only question was, would a list of the games be available for everyone
I could
after?
totally do that. Yeah.
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 But yes.
So some concerns that we have around safety tools, though, is essentially, I'll go into this a little bit more in the next slide, is social pressure. Are they being used? Do people actually feel comfortable asking for a pause, throwing the X, talking about what's going on? Are they effective, right? We're putting these out there as a way for players to communicate discomfort, but is that actually happening? Are they being utilized in that way? And so do they work as intended? This would be where we would go to the research, which is lacking, unfortunately. And so, there's a lot that we really need to do here. We can look at some of what we know. It is very difficult to go against the grain. I talk about these studies in a second, but Zimbardo and Milgram's two big studies are really big examples of this, right? Milgram's compliance study, I think most people are familiar with this one. The only prompt people were given was something along the lines of the experiment needs to continue. And people would push a button to what they thought was a deadly amount of electricity. They thought that they killed somebody just because they were told the experiment needs to continue. It is incredibly difficult to stand up to authority. And so it's something that we really need to be thinking about. And so, with that, it's like, how do we address that? So looking at all of these things, like Larry James, unfortunately, he's been very vilified by the Psychological Association because of his different roles in the US military, but he was a psychologist who was sent to fix everything at Abu Ghraib. And understanding like what happened, like before he left on the plane, Zimbardo actually gave him copies of all of the tapes from the Stanford prison experiment. And he said he spent the whole traveling from, I think, Hawaii to Iraq, watching these videos over and over again, trying to go, where did Zimbardo mess up? Why did nobody speak up? And to understand, like, why did so many people let such bad things happen? What's going on with the social pressure? How do we decrease social pressure? I don't think we've really gotten a great understanding yet of how to stand up to social pressure. We're teaching people to do it. We're becoming much less just blindly compliant to authority, which, pluses and minuses, but I think one of the pluses is people are much more able to stand up for themselves now. Resources and tools, the Deck of Player Safety, I highly, highly recommend this product. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. It's a deck of cards, and you can see some examples here. The way you use this tool is you split up the deck into equal parts for every player, give everybody a stack and an envelope. They are required to pull one card from their stack and put it into the envelope and pass the stack along, and it goes around until everybody's had each stack. And then all of the envelopes are shuffled, handed to the game master. Game master shuffles them up, pulls out the cards, shuffles the cards. So we don't know who put what into what envelope. And then they lay them out on the table. And it's great to understand and see all what's going on. Again, Monty Cook's Consent in Gaming. Another awesome one too, if you're not familiar with the website Writing the Other, it talks about just some great resources for understanding how ableism, sexism, racism can come into different narratives and how to kind of avoid those scenarios. So I think it's a really great thing. I didn't put it in the slide, but my book might also be a decent resource because I do talk about safety tools and how to use them quite a bit in there as well. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left. So conclusions, final thoughts here. All right, so games are an incredibly important part of our lives. And bringing gaming into our day-to-day lives, I think, is incredibly important. We learn so much about ourselves and through others through playing. And they do help us build empathy, especially role-playing games. I see it in the people that I work with. Again, research needed to support my experiences, but I think it really can. And then when we are approaching difficult topics, when we're having difficult topics in play, we do want to have safety tools. Even if we're finding that safety tools aren't utilized as much as we would like due to social pressure, due to compliance, having them at least communicates to our players that we're thinking about this stuff. And it helps people know that we're being mindful. And so that's something really, really important. But again, more research is needed. The resources, I'll go back there. Whoops. Sorry, I forget that I have to go through all the clicks. So the Deck of Player Safety, I'm not sure, they independently publish that, so I'm not sure always where you can get it. Actually, I think they recently partnered with Hit Point Press, so you might be able to get that through Hit Point Press. And then Monty Cook, I think it's just montycook.com for the Consent in Gaming. And Writing the Other is the webpage for that. All right. There's my book if you're interested in this topic. Someone's asking about reacting to the past games. So the game that I played was from, was it Hampshire, England? And it was this time where the church was losing power and the mayors were gaining power. And my role was I was a historian and I wanted to keep the peace amongst everybody because these plays were going on and there was a lot of looking for secret heretics and trying to find folks in there. And so we had somebody role playing the mayor, somebody role playing a person who had just returned from a pilgrimage, someone who was a heretic and didn't support anything that the church was doing. I think we had the Archbishop of Canterbury there as well. And we were all role playing these different things in this room and walking around and trying to organize things. And the organizer of the event would every now and then kind of ding a bell or something and be like, okay, so now it's time for us to have the discussion of how is the play going to happen? And would so-and-so please step forward and talk about their piece? It was absolutely amazing. So yeah, look into the reacting to the past stuff. It's kind of interesting because the folks who are writing those scenarios and those games don't think about them as games, which is bizarre because they are. And I think it's a really important tool for learning and understanding history in a much more dynamic and interesting way. All right. Do other folks have questions? Oh. Let's see. What are two? So question is, what would be RPGs that would be easy to have in a library setting? Dungeons, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons is great. It is the most widely played tabletop role-playing game in the world. So there's a ton of resources for it. There's a ton of different materials for it. A newer edition of the rules just came out, so which probably means it'll be easy to get the 5th edition rules. Well, actually, the 5th edition rules are in Creative Commons, and so you can get them for free. And so it's a very well-known game, and so it would be very easy to find folks to run the game, play the game, and to do that. And oh, they haven't responded to D&D. So I think like it depends a little bit on the creativity. If folks are incredibly creative and don't feel the need to have a ton of rules, Kids on Bikes is awesome. Because it is very open. I like having a little bit more framework to work with than Kids on Bikes and Kids on Rooms provides. But that system can be great. The Bohana Group actually has a system called Branch Riders coming out, which is really cool because it allows for people to have characters from any setting you want. You can have Star Wars characters next to anime characters, next to fantasy characters, next to superheroes, and they all can work together on a single quest. That should be coming out and available on it will be available in December, and I think they're going through oh gosh, Tabletop, I can't remember who they're publishing with, but it'll be available in December. And then I think too, like it for the 13 to 17-year-olds, like it's finding out what they're interested in. Like if they're really into anime and something like Avatar, there's actually an Avatar: The Last Airbender role-playing game. That's pretty easy. It uses just D6s. It's a fairly easy one to pick up. If they're wanting more of like a reality kind of like game, something more like The Last of Us, there's one called Outbreak Undead. You actually make yourself as a character in that game during a zombie apocalypse, and you're trying to survive a zombie apocalypse. So there's a lot of different options out there for different types of games. I'm seeing a bunch of stuff come through. So
There we had a question from Lois. Do you believe the continued stigma on video games and TTRPGs is why game studies hasn't grown as much as prominent academic study?
I think
As
so.
yeah.
And I think like I've not directly seen this in the American Psychological Association, but the feeling I get a lot of times is play is for children. And play therapy is othered in the world of psychology. And so because it involves play of any kind, it's kind of dismissed. And as the old guard is going out and new folks are coming up in leadership in these different societies, I am seeing a shift in that. It's slight, but there definitely is a shift. The more research we're doing, the more benefits we're showing, the more it's gaining traction. But it is, I think, a lot of it is old guard that still sees play as a thing for children and not for adults, and therefore we don't need to take it seriously, which I think is a problem.
And then Malcolm asks, when offering TTRPGs for patrons to play, is it better to keep patrons as players, or is it equally useful for building empathy to let one of them be the DM?
Yeah, I think being the DM, I would guess that it would require and create a lot more empathy gains because you have to understand the motivations and the points of views of all the non-player characters. And really effective DMs also are able to think through their player character points of view too, to go, how do I think so-and-so's character would react to seeing this? If I want them to follow this pathway, what are things that I think would help hook them into these things? And so as being a DM, yeah, you've got to take all of that stuff into consideration. And it's really cool too to see kids kind of blossom as dungeon masters or game masters when they take the control of it. There's a lot of fun things. And I do wish academia would look into this much more. It is, we're finally starting to see more games being published. I'm really hoping that an edition or two of my book from now, I can write that I've finally gotten to take out all the places where I said more research is needed, because that is throughout my book.
Yeah, I have dropped the link in the chat for the LEU form, but I'll do that one more time,
Oh, thank you.
just in case anyone missed it the first time. But if you have any other questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. Oh, here we go. What are your thoughts about the Proteus effect?
I'm not familiar with the Proteus effect. That is a lack in my knowledge that I need to fill.
I think someone mentioned it earlier, but I don't know how far back in the chat that was.
I'm scrolling up too. We'll see if we can find.
And if not, maybe they'll repost.
Oh, video game avatars. So with video game avatars compared to tabletop role-playing game, like what I've at least witnessed for myself with both being a player and somebody who talks with folks, you're not as engaged with your video game avatar typically as your role-playing game avatar. And I think that has to do with agency, that even though in a lot of video games, even the open world video games, you have a lot of choice, your choice kind of doesn't really matter all that much. And so it's much easier to have your avatar engage in behaviors that you're not interested in. Whereas for role-playing games, it feels much closer to you, I think. And so it's, like we see a lot of folks who play games like Grand Theft Auto, things like that, where the game mechanic is basically to be antisocial, but will engage in behaviors they never would normally. In role-playing games, you can behave in ways that you would never do normally. You can push that, but it's an interesting thing because like I've been in games where people have made choices that are kind of awful. And a lot of times the players stop and they go, oh my God, what does that say about me that I just had my character do that? I don't like that. I think I need to do some self-reflection here. And so it's that interesting thing of it is a people growing device, I think, to help people reflect and look in. And I know we're at time, so I know people
I was gonna
probably
say,
have to
if
bounce.
there are any other questions, feel free to put those in. If you have filled out the form, we thank you for being here. I have to end
Yeah.
the recording here.
And then there's the big reference section that is too small to read. And I did send in the slides, so if you want to send these to the
Yeah.
people who want them, feel free. It's
Yep.
totally fine.
We will do that.